now, from the great state of Mississauga in Ontario, Canada, it's the Ted Woloshyn Podcast. Brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's fashion, Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. ETP Canada. And now, here's Ted.
Thank you so much. Welcome back to another episode of the Ted Woloshyn Podcast. Brand new year it is, 2025, and a brand new program for a guy who's not brand new, but a guy who's been missed by a lot of us who are sports fans. Mike Richards, on January the 12th, reappears as if he had gone away somewhere. Of course, he hasn't. On City News Calgary, 9:30 Mountain Time, 11:30 Eastern Time. Mike Richards, how are you?
I'm fantastic. It's fatiguing, as you know, being in this business. Either you watch all your coworkers be sent to the salt mines, or the salt mines don't exist at all. It gets a little lonely, I think, for all of us in this business, because I think we really, we're very much attached also emotionally to what we've done all our lives, 20, 30 years, most of us. And I think when that gets taken away, aside from people just assume it's the ego part of it, but I think it's also, quite frankly, Ted, the social aspect of it, passing the people in the hallways, going on, knowing that you're hopefully entertaining people who are driving to work, exchanging between, those people, whether it's text or emails. It's very much a social job. And I think when that gets taken away from us, Ted, it's very isolating. And I think it's been a really hard time for all of us in this business.
I mean, when COVID hit, everybody sort of got to experience what we're kind of experiencing in our line of work. And I mean, thank God for Zoom and we use Riverside here for our program. But thank God for that you can at least now talk to somebody. Remember we used to do phone interviews on the radio?
Yeah.
Phone interviews are okay because you could speak to somebody who wasn't in your city, but you could at least speak to them. But there's no... When you can't see the person, you can't establish eye contact, tend to jump all over each other because you don't know when they're going to speak and you're going to speak. And so it makes it easier. But by the same token, because we're doing this, there's no need to go into a studio, at least
right.
in my case. And I miss that. I miss the interaction with guests before we actually start talking on the air.
Sure. I mean, it's funny, back when it was the Team 1050, one of the 1050 incarnations, and at this point of myself and Paul Romanuk, and we were doing an interview because we were at the Grey Cup, so we were in Montreal, and then back at the station in Toronto, Reggie Jackson was there. So this is a big thrill. I mean, Reggie Jackson, this is one of the gods, one of the legends.
Yeah.
What we didn't know was, I guess they made him wait a long time. Reggie wasn't happy. Reggie was very unhappy. So we couldn't see his face, which might have been a good thing, because the first question we asked, there's just this stone cold silence, just this tumbleweeds and air conditioners in the background. I thought, well, this is going well. Like we didn't know that he had been sitting and someone screwed up. So he was sitting for an hour and a half. We got through it, and eventually you make it through. But the ability to see each other on an interview, and again, something like this, to see friendly faces, it really is quite brilliant. I mean, as much as technology drives us all nuts, this one I can live with. This is okay.
Yeah. And the thing too is like when you began your career, and we're going to talk about that in a second, but before we get talking about the new show. But when you began your career, you kind of envisioned how it would progress if things went well enough that you could make it out of small, medium markets to the big city, wherever the big city in your mind is. But you never really imagined that the whole industry would sort of stand on its head and flip backwards and go like, what the hell is going on here?
Yeah. Yeah, I never would have thought, for instance, with this new show, that being the host of a sports television show was going to be one of a kind. I mean, we're not talking about Bob McCown's. We're not talking about other personalities that have been sort of legendary or goats in this genre. That it's all gone. That even the biggest of the broadcast companies that have sports channels don't have these shows. They don't have a Canadian hosted opinionated show for Canadians. It doesn't exist. I'm it. That is just extraordinary to think that this country this big that is sports nuts. I mean, granted, it's regional. This is a very regional country, but the fact that we don't have a person hosting a show is, well, it's very sad. And hopefully this can this can do something. But as you said, when you look at how you think your career would be, I did not think in some ways that I'd be the last man standing. I just didn't. Would never have occurred to me that you might be the last in line.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. Before we move forward with that, let's go back. How did this all begin for you, and whereabouts?
Well, I'm originally from Stouffville, Ontario.
Yeah.
And my father being an educator, so he was phys ed and English and music, very well-rounded and loved man from where we were from. I somehow, through hockey, and I played at a pretty high level of goal, but I was always, slightly odd. I was always doing impressions. I mean, goalies are weird, right? I mean, goalies have that reputation, and I did impressions while it was going on. And I think by the time I got to junior B, so I was 14, my coaches were like Mike Keenan, and they flew in Jacques Martin. Like it was setting up to be, pretty exciting. My
I didn't
uncle,
know that.
yeah, my uncle, Guy Kinnear, a lot of know Gunnar Kinnear was the longtime trainer for the Toronto Maple Leafs. So, I'm thinking, okay, you talk about envisioning what your life would be. Oh, I'm seeing the lights. I mean, I'm seeing Mike Palmetier, like I'm seeing, the puck bunnies, the beautiful girls enamored by my flow, the hair underneath the mask. I mean, this was the vision. And then I went to Yuck Yucks once as a high school kid, and I auditioned at a club, an old club called the Soho. Was it called the Soho? Or yes, the Soho.
Yeah.
And the Rivoli at the Met, all those. And I met someone by the name of Rob Salem, who you might know.
Of course.
And he saw me up there doing impressions, and he was like, because he was just the greatest guy. I mean, he is. I mean, he's just a very smart guy, very funny guy. He's like, you could do this. I could do what? What? I'm doing impressions of Red Fox and Danny Gallivan or whatever it was at the time. He goes, no, you could do this. It's kind of funny. It's weird to see a kid doing like adult voices, but this is around the same time the whole Jim Carrey thing. And at one point they wanted to put us together, and the great horrible decisions that I make, it's like the Tales of Costanza. I make these horrific decisions, and they say, there's this tall guy who's also around here. Does the faces though. He's a tall guy. Really, his name's Jim Carrey. We could put you two guys together and be like a hilarious impression show. And I was Ted. I'm like, yeah, I'm probably going to be in the NHL, so I don't know what his little plan is, but it probably doesn't fit into where I'm going. Nice decision. That worked out well. So that was mistake one. But what in doing the stand up, two guys from CKY saw me, Robert Payne and Dick Young. Robert goes, say, have you ever thought about getting into radio? And I was like, I'm not attracted to you. I don't want to do stuff. Like, I don't know what's going on here in the hallway, but I feel very intimidated right now. He goes, no, you should come down to Key 590. I think they called it. I think it was the old CKY 590 studios, right by actually the Toronto Star, right down there. And I did one interview, and I thought maybe I could do this. So I went to Fanshawe College, and it was horrible for a year, barely got grades, but good enough just to sneak into Ryerson. So I did 1 year at Ryerson and realized I just wanted to be on the air. So I sent the tape to CKBB in Barrie, and I did basically all nights. And from that, a guy who eventually goes to Chum FM that summer, he said, I was talking to the guys down at Chum about you, and what do you think? So I went from, not really understanding what I would do, and then I'm sitting, 1331 Yonge Street. Guys like Mike Holland are walking by, and Brian Henderson and the late great Dick Smythe, which was probably the most intimidating human being that I met as a kid, because I'd seen him and heard him all these years, and of course the hair was, I had the long hair and an earring because I'm an idiot. And he looks at me, he goes, let me ask you something. Have you ever thought that maybe wearing an earring, slightly effeminate, makes you sort of a sort of a, and he basically insulted me. I hadn't even started yet. I thought I was going to cry. And that's where it started. 1050 Chum back in 1986 was my first radio job.
Wow. And that's a job that people dream of, that never imagine that dream. And they never realize that dream from the first. So that to happen to you is just really quite amazing. And because you were in radio, most people got into radio because they got into radio for one of two reasons. You either wanted to do news, or you wanted to collect albums, right? Get free records, right? You and I are a little bit different, though, because you wanted to be in radio because you wanted to entertain people, which was my my desire as well. It wasn't about collecting. I always used to joke that music got in the way of my show, which never went over well with the program director. But you know,
You mean when you had the, as I said, as a kid and you're in high school and you hear comedy albums, right? So you hear, the hours where you would play all those amazing comedy bits, whether it was from National Lampoon or, when I heard that people could create comedy that you could like a sketch, or as I've come to know, parody bits, or that was it for me. I mean, that was a huge influence between listening to that and when I'm watching SCTV.
mm-hmm.
I said, so you can do, hold on, wait a minute. So you could do characters, you could do voices, all of it sort of with the background. You got a little bit of the Saturday Night Live sort of a feel to it. And I thought, but that's entertainment. That's what I wanted. I really didn't think about the music all that much. Like I really didn't.
Yeah.
I thought, if I go on there and you're doing these impressions and you're making people laugh, and I was always a co-host, right? I mean, I was, when I went from doing all nights at 1050 Chum, I ended up being sort of everybody's co-host for a very long time, really until I go to Calgary in 2004. I am always somebody's guy. My name was never first. There was always the word "and" in front of it. That became tough for me at some point. And I look back now and I'm like, look, I worked with this. I think all of them are probably in the Radio Hall of Fame, but they're all my contemporaries are gone dead. I mean, when you look back to who I first started with, so Jerry Forbes, of course, longtime friend as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jerry's retired. You look at John Derringer, not in the business. Other guys like Bob McCowan, who was literally pushed out. You have the Jesse and Jeans of the world, although I see our good buddy Gene just moved back to Ontario, which is kind of fun. But Brother Jake, you've got John Gallagher. You go down the list of all those that I worked with and certainly looked up to. They're all gone. They're all gone. I take a little bit of, I don't know, I suppose a line in the sand attitude with this new show, in that I want to make sure that people understand there's still a fight going on. And certainly it is for me to let people know that I don't care what your age is. I mean, you're like, wow, you're trying to prove that a guy who's 60 can still do it. I said, no, I really don't think about it that way, because I feel like my job was taken away from me at Bell. Not TSN. People think I'm mad at TSN. TSN's owned by Bell, and they tell them what to do. And they've almost destroyed it. And I think they'll probably won't be in the business anyways much longer. I'm sure Bell will be thrilled to get rid of every broadcast property they have. But it's difficult, Ted, I think, when it's taken away from you, rather than a guy like Jerry or Brother Jake, these guys who are able to retire. A lot of us either can't or weren't ready to retire, and it's gone. It's just gone.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I know you've got this passion for Calgary because that's where you had your first great success.
Yes.
It was on the air in Calgary. So how did you make your way back to Calgary now and on television on top of that? And will you be available for the mass audiences through streaming or through...
Yeah. Well, there's some of that. So it will be on the Rogers platform. So those out in Calgary will, it's going to be on City TV, just like you would see it here.
Right.
And so it will exist on the Rogers platform. So if you want to go and look back at the programming and you're going to see raw Mike Richards, and you'll be able to get it that way. But there will be some other ways streaming. I don't have the exact answer at this point. I know we're literally like hours away from probably getting to this, but it will be available to the masses, because I know that a lot of people here in Toronto, and look, your fans get a little miffed sometimes. I mean, they figure that you've chosen maybe another province or city over where they live. And by far, the biggest numbers I have are in Southern Ontario, but the greatest support I've ever received in my life. And for those of you who have ever worked in Western Canada, or certainly lived in Calgary, or there is something just so, Ted, very different about how the Westerner sees the world. And everyone in that book that I wrote, I know it sounds stupid. I mean, if anyone should be talking about a book they wrote, it shouldn't be me. I don't think I read one before I wrote one. But I said for at least a couple of years, everyone in this part of the world should have a chance to live in Calgary, just so you know what the rest of the country is like. That it's not just, once you go west of Oakville, that the world ends. There's more to the country than just that. Great people, and the people that I've known. And, when it became so difficult, you talked about COVID. Well, for someone like myself wanting to be in sports radio, it's kind of when a lot of these companies decided that they were going to go, and I'll say it, in what many would describe as the woke period of society, they certainly didn't want a middle-aged, white guy who, at times had made some good money. It was like we were certainly not the flavor of the day.
No.
Regardless of what salary I'd be asking for, I'm certainly not someone that, isn't for diversity or talking about the advantages of being, open-minded. I mean, it had nothing to do with that, but we didn't get a say in that. We were just written off. And so every person I can think of was completely shut down, where it's like, if you didn't fit into that parameter of what they wanted to see and talk about, then you didn't exist. Well, to me, how is that diverse? That's the opposite of diversity.
Yeah.
You're trying to get to diversity by extinction. That, to me, Ted, doesn't work. And you know what? It hasn't worked because you can see that the pendulum has swung back because people realized it just went too far. And I think that, look, I realize politically there's people to the right, there's people to the left, and I'm not a very political guy. But I do understand that when you see the kinds of people of what they're running for and being successful at and with in politics, that you realize there is sort of a swing back, hopefully to the middle, which I think most people, normal people, kind of live in the middle.
I think
They
most
don't
people
want to
do
be to
live
the
in the middle.
extremes. Yeah.
Which is what I was going to mention earlier, because you're raw, Mike Richards, and I wonder
Yeah.
what makes you raw, because I'm kind of, medium well. And I think it's the people who are like, well done are the ones who are eroding everything.
It is. And I think that's a great way. That's a great way of looking at it. So I guess raw, yeah, probably, I certainly would be that way. And the reason I call it that is because I'm not really afraid to talk about any topic. As long as the audience wants to hear it and can handle it and can take it, it's sort of like being a stand-up. People who go and see a stand-up comedian and then are angry, disappointed, or feel they have to boo or something. Well, what are you doing there? Why did you walk in the door knowing very well that this is a place for open ideas on how that person who has the microphone at that time, how he sees the world? If you don't like him, it's fine. You don't make a noise. You don't laugh. You wait for the next guy. But this thing about going and then roasting a comic for what their material was about.
Well, it's the same as when you read, like, social media is so guilty of this. Social media can be the greatest tool and the devil's tool at the same time, because you get people who are constantly going on and complaining about somebody, like whatever, they hate me for whatever reason. Ted Woloshyn's an idiot. Ted Woloshyn, if I'm such an idiot, why do you keep listening to me? Like, why would you, how would you? And I know you're listening because you're commenting on something that I said the week before.
Yes.
Or the day before. And if you didn't, then if you weren't listening, you wouldn't know I said that. And you wouldn't be complaining, shut up and go somewhere else.
Well, and that's what, I mean, the constant thing certainly when I mixed all the comedy with the sports, the hardcore sports guy would not be a fan of Mike Richards at times, simply because they think I fool around too much. And because I mix in a lot of different elements that aren't sports, that somehow that means I don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
that I am less than. And I'm like, okay, well, I put it to you this way. There are guys who would know, when you say a lot more about sports, I'm talking about the trivia guys. The guys who can tell you who were drafted in 1975, they can tell you the third line guy for Nashville right now. I admit, I'm not one of those guys. I'm not a sports nerd. But what I do know, Ted, is that if you wanted me tomorrow to go to your high school and coach a certain sport at a certain level, including all seniors, I'm very comfortable with this. I'm very comfortable at coaching basketball or volleyball or your hockey team or your football team. Mm-hmm. I excelled at sports as a kid, but there wasn't sports radio when I started. I mean, sports radio didn't come to the city until, 1992, when Mike Inglis and CJCL flips over to the Fan, and Joe Bowen, I think, had come on at that point, and then Bob McCown and so on. But I was more concentrated eventually on hopefully being at Q107. I mean, that would have been my goal, was Q107. And like, it would have been anybody else's who listened to Scruff Connors or of that genre. I mean, Q107 was the place to be. And ironically, I never got there. The only time that it looked like it was going to be close, that's when they brought in Howard Stern. And so everything sort of got put on hold, and then it got flipped over. And that's, I basically went head first into sports, which is fine by me. Yeah. But,
the concept of people thinking you don't take sports seriously enough, I would argue that point by saying some people take it too seriously. It is, by the way, it's a game. Hockey is a game. Golf is a game. I mean, it's these. I mean, yeah, I realize that there are inherent risks, and people do die playing these games. Not that often. I mean, We're not talking about, the Indy 500 here. We're talking about sports. But even if we were talking about that, even those guys, you look at them, and some of the greatest characters in professional sports never took the game that seriously. They
That's
did
correct.
when they were on the ice. But a guy like Gordie Howe had a great sense of humor, who goofed around a
Yeah.
lot more than people would have realized. They would think, well, he's so serious. Well, is he?
Yeah, and I think that in your life, and I always look at, the shows that we've done, the shows I've done in the past, and that I always look at it like the cocktail party. And I always say that, when you're in there and you don't know people and you're talking, I mean, sometimes you're running into these people and you find them really fascinating. They have nice stories. They have a great background. They're, very verbal. There's they're entertaining. And I said, if you can put on a show that kind of has a little bit of all those elements, you're probably going to be okay.
Yep.
Now, if you're the dirty guy, then the guy drops like a horrifically dark joke, and you're like, when you walk around the hallway with your wife or whatever, and you come around and there's that guy again, he's going to drop that joke or one that's very similar. So all of a sudden you start to avoid those people. Well, guess what? The worst person in that category is the sports nerd, because I don't want to be pinned by a Leaf fan. Hey, Mike, what do you think about Austin Matthews? And I'm like, okay, let me just tell you. I've had the same conversation about this team for 9 years. I just can't talk about it anymore. To a point where you don't want to say you don't care, but I'm not leading with a Leaf anecdote. Like, I'm not going to get you into the corner, Ted, and then start talking about the problems of goaltending or the fact that the Leafs only want to make money. Yeah, we've had that conversation in this town for 30 years.
I know.
I can't do it
after
anymore.
a while, it's like, oh no, I can't talk about that anymore. But you know what? If you take a look in the States, the guys, the really successful guys doing the kinds of stuff that you are going to do again, guys like Rich Eisen, Dan Patrick, Jim Rome, they're not just interviewing athletes. I mean, Dan Patrick's got his buddy Sandman on there all the time talking about his latest movies, and
Yep.
Rich Eisen has all kinds of different people on. And I would assume that's what we're going to hear from you, and
Yes.
we're going to see with you come later this month.
Well, one of the first guests, and I've changed it just because I've moved up the timetable to catch the NFL playoffs, because
Right.
This is a ratings business, and I know if I go on at the same time and talk about the NFL, I assume my show will get numbers. But when I'm talking about the heat of the moment of the NFL, I know what that does. We're in this business. We understand that. But after that, one of the guys that I was going to have on first is Pierre Poilievre. He's going to be the next prime minister, and he says a lot of things. And sometimes the House, if you see those clips, it looks like yucks. I mean, I want to talk to this guy. He's from the West, obviously. Spent all that time. His mom still lives in Calgary. And I think that, there are certain people who interview looking for a political answer. I don't know this guy. Like, I really don't know him, but I am assuming, unless he gets sucked up into a tornado, that he will be the next prime minister at some point. And I have interviewed the last three of them. I've interviewed the last three guys we've had. So I will look forward to trying to figure out, Ted, like the cocktail party. I'm going to go in there and say, so where'd you go to high school? What'd you do? I'm going to find out exactly who this guy is. And I've done that. One of the guys who I thought at TSN 1050 I had a lot of fun with Tim Hudak. Tim Hudak came in. I knew nothing of him. I ended up really liking this guy. Like, I forget about the politics, forget about everything else that happens. He was always welcome in my studio as I try to provide for everybody. I rarely am, Ted, I'm trying to get someone in there. So someone said, oh, you don't radio guys. I go, what are you talking about? Some guys get radioed. I go, I'm sorry. I don't know what that means. I'm not familiar with it. And I guess they just mean being hijacked and, sort of a hardcore take on guys. Well, that's not my show. That's not my show, Ted. That's the opposite. I don't want
for a gotcha moment.
Yeah. That's not for me.
Yeah. So where will you be doing this program from? Calgary, from here, from everywhere?
It's initially going to be from here. So it's 13 weeks, and basically it's kind of a I'm not saying a test, but I want to prove that in that 13 weeks I can do a show that my demographic, which I would say is males 25-54, but basically adults 18 plus are going to watch the show. They're going to be enjoyed. And that I'll also bring sponsors, and show a number, ratings wise, that my promise of performance is that I can get you a successful program, even though they're not sinking money into it necessarily, Rogers. They're not really. So, but they are allowing me this time. And I used to think, well, geez, if the company's not paying you to do it, then maybe you're not very good. Maybe you're buying your time because you're not talented. In this world, try finding a place to buy time. If you're a fishing show or an exercise show or a religious show, I guess you have your ways of buying it. But to be a contemporary, sort of a mainstream talk show, you're going to find that all the companies give you almost no time whatsoever. So the fact that they're going to give me a half an hour, it was going to be an hour, had to switch it up a little bit. It eventually will be an hour to make it available for me and sort of promote me as well. And sort of Rogers has been outstanding for me. And look, everyone's experience with these companies is different, right? You work with someone who said, oh, they were fantastic. The next guy goes, are you kidding? They fired me on Christmas Eve. And, you have all these terrible stories. Yeah. I will say that for Rogers, in my experience, including when I was in Calgary at the Fan, has always been excellent. It's always been very, very good. And they're kind of coming through for me again. So I need to prove for 13 weeks that I can do what I say it's going to do. Like it's a put up or shut up kind of moment.
Right. So I'm just thinking that how the landscape of sports has changed. I mean, we look now, without getting too, inside baseball here, because this isn't a sports podcast per se. So, I mean, I know a lot of people who listen who are big sports fans, but, we're not looking for that specific bits and pieces that you might find that you just joked about. But you take a look now, I mean, the prominence of women in sports now, with the Women's Professional Hockey League and women, the WNBA and how that's exploded. Caitlin Clark is huge. I mean, women's North American women's soccer. I mean, it's a lot big, different landscape than it was 10 years ago. And even now, look at college sports where they've got this nil thing, name, image, and likeness. So now you've got kids in college who are making like $2 million a year doing endorsements while they're, quote, studying for their bachelor's degree.
Well, it's, for me, and you talked about Raw Mike Richards and the name of the show itself, which means I'm going to be as authentic as I can, meaning you may not like the raw opinion that I'm going to say. For instance, I think that the WNBA is a giant Bush League hack, disgusting display of arrogance and bigotry. Caitlin Clark is the only reason any of us, including myself, my father, as I said, a longtime coach, he going on and on about Caitlin Clark all the time. I said, Dad, I'm not watching women's basketball. I'm sorry. I watch every sport. We're Irish in background, so I watch hurling. I wish I was making that up, Ted. I wish I was. I watch hurling and Gaelic football. I'll watch anything that moves, but I have to be engaged by it. So I'm not going to force someone to watch a sport that they truly. For instance, some guys will only watch NFL football. If I get into a conversation about the CFL, the eyes start to roll and they're gone. But I can't make them like the CFL. I just know that they don't. It's everyone's preference. I don't watch and hadn't watched a ton of women's basketball simply because the nature of the game, it did nothing for me. And that's right now. I'm only talking about women's basketball. When I saw Caitlin Clark that first game, my jaw hit the floor. Very rarely have I seen an athlete like that just completely take over my imagination. The way that she handles herself, the dignity, the accountability, the athleticism, the competitive nature. This person, male or female, was a specimen to me that I was just really quite enamored with. So I started watching. I mean, I watch a lot of college sports, but it was never watching women's basketball. But with Caitlin, I started watching. And then she goes to the WNBA, and I'm like, well, this should be interesting because the only reason eyeballs are on this league that's subsidized by the NBA, they wouldn't exist without them putting cash in that check. And then I see her get mugged. I see her get pushed down. I see her get now look, in every sport, do I think that the hotshot rookie comes in and gets a tough time? Yeah, I do. Just talk to any hockey player or football. But except when the gravy train comes into your existence, what you try not to do is break them down. What you try to do is humiliate them. I mean, it went on, and the league became almost protective of the players that were doing that. And I said, I'm done with you. I wouldn't bother me if Caitlin Clark said, you know what, I'm going to cash you a check for $100 million, and I'm going to play in Spain for the rest of my life. I've already put up with the thuggery that went on there. It sickened me, and the fact that they protected it, and then now it's a racial issue, which in sport kind of defeats the purpose of why we watch sports in the first place. Now, I'm not naive, Dad. I'm obviously covering these athletes and coaches and general managers and ownership for 30 years. I understand the makings of it, but for the most part, what I feel is the most important thing about the sport is that once the puck is dropped, the ball is kicked, once the referee throws the ball up in the air on the court, it's about the competition. It's about the team coming together and winning a championship. And really, to my experience, most of it is only about that. But this became this polarizing issue of white and black, also gay and straight, because you're talking about the WNBA. There are some issues there that got so ugly that I'm not interested in anymore. I can't. I'm not going to watch it. And people say, "Oh, you don't like women's basketball?" I said, "It's not about that. What are you talking about? College, whatever?" Yeah, there are women's sports that I do watch. The irony is, in the most testosterone-fueled sport in the world, the most violent sport you can think of, which would be mixed martial arts, there's nothing more. You talk about polarizing. These guys get in there with no fat. They literally could rip each other's head, and they pound on each other for these 10, 15 minutes, maybe longer, depending on it. But the other matches that are just as good is almost every single women's match. The women, and in that sport, and you get all the bros watching this sport, right? So guys, me, a cap on backwards, pumping back beers, yelling stuff. You would think they would be the worst and the most sexist guys against a women's fight. No. They understand the level of technique and fighting that these women have in UFC. For the gamblers, they will bet just as much on a women's fight, and sometimes it might be the best fight of the night.
Yeah.
It's not about women versus men, which is, and again, another argument that just drives me nuts. It's about, Ted, what you like. So am I going to watch the WNBA? No. Am I going to watch the PWHL? I haven't seen 1 second of it. It's just, it's not going to be something that's going to hold my attention. I'm not going to pretend that I know all about some of the great hockey players of our time that played on our national team or the women's national team. I think are some of the finest people I've ever known. Hayley Wickenheiser is an absolute treasure for this country. She is an amazing human being. Cassie Campbell, I got to know, and I just adored her in all ways. That she was just such a nice person, smart, funny. You got all these kinds of. But if you're going to start asking me who's on the third line or on the power play for any of the women's teams or even our national team, Ted, I don't know, and I'm not going to lie about it. I'm not going to start talking like I know and I'm the great defender of these sports when I don't watch 1 second of it.
Well, I don't think it's that important, honestly, for a sports broadcaster to know. I mean, unless you're a color analyst for an NFL game, you better know everything about the game.
Right.
But I don't think for a sports broadcaster who's covering a whole myriad of sports, I don't think it's important for you to know about every sport and about every line and every position and every little nuance of the game. I think that's impossible. I think you'd have to have no life in order to do that. And if you got no life, you probably got no personality. If you got no personality, you don't belong in the radio or television to begin with. Right?
I agree with all those points because we have shows where I turn it on, I'm like, buddy, we get it. You know a lot of stats. You know a lot of stuff about synchronized diving. Great. There's 15 minutes of my life I'm not getting back. I can't believe I listened to this whole dissertation on the importance of bouncing.
I mean, who do you want to, do you want to listen to guys like Bob Costas or over the years, Brian Williams, or do you want to listen to a guy who lives on analytics that can spit out every statistic and the odds of this field goal going through, or should they run, should they throw? That to me is like, God, you're over dissecting this thing.
It's paint drawing. Like I said, there should be a working knowledge, and there are things that you probably as a person, you know better than some subjects you know better than others. So for instance, I mean, I'm a big football guy, both north and south of the border, both pro and college. I'm a huge college basketball guy. I like watching track. I coach volleyball, like a lot of things that I like. Hockey, of course, was very important to me, and I watch it, but not with the same intensity that I would watch football.
No.
I'd also say that baseball is kind of last on my list. It wasn't my thing. So I won't go on the air and start telling you ad nauseum all the issues that I think are wrong. For instance, with the Toronto Blue Jays, I'll have my own take on it, but Ted, I'll bring someone on who actually does. I'll bring someone on and I'll ask questions. I say, but don't you think this was the wrong decision? Or why did the manager? That's the angle I take, because the moment, Ted, I start doing the other thing, then I'm a liar. Then I'm a fake, and you got to take that name raw off, because that's not authentic at all.
And the great thing about how you show your chops, whether you're a good interviewer or not, is when you ask a question and somebody who's watching or listening to your program is going to go, God, I was going to ask that question.
Yeah. Yes.
It's like if you knew what everybody wants to know and you're the guy who asks the question, that's what they want. They don't want your opinion on everything. Sometimes you get these, it's where they think that, well, everything should be about what I think. I don't need guests. It should be just me talking for an hour. And after a while, you become a gas bag. And it's like, nobody wants to listen to a gas bag.
No, I agree 100%, which is why.
But everybody likes to listen to a good impression, by the way.
What's that?
When you do some great impressions. Are we going to hear more impressions as we go along?
Yeah. See, that was the one thing is you know, and you know more probably better than anybody else that comedy changes. If you don't change with the style or the times, that's when guys get called hacks, right? Then so it becomes almost campy, where if you were, for instance, I was always so excited when I knew Richard Little was going to be on anything, because if it was Johnny Carson or if he was going to be on Hollywood Squares, right? I mean, it was just, he's going to do one of the voices, and I was going to be just enamored by it. Then you realize guys coming and saying, so what would it be like if Humphrey Bogart was in it? And that died. And that's why guys like Jim Carrey and all these impressions, they start to separate themselves from that kind of thing. But what I find is, if you're having a conversation and then someone just jumps into the voice because it fits the moment, that's still very welcome. So sometimes when I start talking about the show and what I want to do with the show, just because of the times that we live in, I start thinking it gets a little Trumpish. Some of the things that I say, I'm like, I'll start to say it's a great show, and there's a lot of people who are looking forward to it, and I got to be honest, it's going to be a lot better than the shows that were beforehand, and a lot of people, this is what they're saying, what a great show, fantastic, and now they're crying like dogs because I've got a great show and they've got nothing. They're losers, I'm great, they're terrible, and I'm the best. That's what happens. You just start, dropping these voices, and I find that to be a little more enjoyable too than this kind of the big setup like we used to do. So yeah, I will get the voices in, and a lot of them that I have done over the years. I mean, Bob Cole was always, he was right there. He was always, and people are like, well, can you do that now that he's gone? I said, well, I did Foster for about 30 years after he was dead. So yeah, I'll try to fit it in. Sure. Why not?
There's always room to bring somebody back from the grave for a good laugh, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wish you nothing but the best on the show. It's a pleasure chatting with you. It's great to see you again. Sunday, January it all begins on City News Calgary Television, 9:30 Mountain Time, 11:30 Eastern Standard Time, and you'll be able to get Mike raw or uncooked or even steamed if you want, or smoked. It doesn't matter. Hopefully, we'll all be able to see you right across the country on some kind of a platform.
There'll be numerous ones. There'll be a podcast. There'll be a website also eventually that is being built. It's kind of like flying a plane and building it while you're in the air. Kind of what it feels like a little bit. So there's a couple of things we're tinkering with, but it'll be ready. And thanks so much for having me today, Ted. What a wonderful catch up. And as I said, there's not a lot of us left who can actually have these kind of conversations and talk about certain names. But boy, it's been wonderful here today.
Yeah, I'm thrilled that you had the opportunity to chat, and I wish you all the best.
Thanks, Ted.
Thanks, Nick. That's going to do it for another episode, and thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to check out our website, www.tedwoloshyn.ca, and you can catch up on our past episodes, leave a question or a comment as well. And while you're online, don't forget to fill out your organ and tissue donation card. You can change or even save a life. In the meantime, have a great week.
The Ted Woloshyn podcast has been brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. For more on this podcast and our sponsors, and to talk to Ted, go to www.tedwoloshyn.ca.